Let me just start by saying hello, hello, and applaud all of you for coming this evening to what is our very first in-person IFAR Evening in 3 years. So I'm applauding you all for coming. And thank you, thank you. And it's also our very first hybrid program, in person and virtual. So to all of our virtual attendees, and there are actually more attending virtually than in person, hello to you as well. As many of you know, I am Sharon Flesher, Executive Director of IFAR, and on behalf of everyone at IFAR, our very hardworking and terrific staff, who many of you know, our volunteers who are helping tonight, our board and council members, several of whom are attending today, both in person and virtually, and one of whom is sitting right on our stage today, Kate Gans. On behalf of all of us, I want to welcome you to what I know will be another wonderful IFAR evening. Many of you know IFAR well. I know there are a lot of familiar faces, but others are here for the very first time. So I invite you all to pick up our literature outside in the registration area, where we'll have a little reception after the program, and also to check out our website, ifar.org. That way you can learn more about us, and hopefully it'll spur you to subscribe to our award-winning IFAR Journal, a little plug here, which recently published a special 50th anniversary celebratory issue that you can still get ordering via our website. And to our subscribers and supporters, you'll be getting the next journal soon. While you're on our website, please check out our online resources, our catalog raisonné database, our art, law, and cultural property database, our provenance guide. I think you'll find these resources extremely useful. Maybe they'll encourage you to become an IFAR member supporter. As a nonprofit, we could certainly use that support. Anyway, we do so much good for the art world and public, so why not? Now, to tonight's program, which asks the question, is there a case for connoisseurship in a high-tech era? And perhaps we could insert the word traditional in front of connoisseurship, as you wish. This is a subject that IFAR comes by naturally. Our founding purpose, and we expanded, as you all know, into other areas over the years, theft, law, restitution, provenance, and fraud, and other legal and ethical issues. But our founding purpose was to be an independent, authoritative organization divorced from the marketplace that could weigh in on issues of attribution and authenticity. And to this day, 50 years later, we still offer an art authentication research service. So it is one of the services that we offer. Now, at this point, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and be a semi-speaker, if you will, because I've been asked to say some things so that the people on the panel don't have to take the time to say this. So I'll be going a little longer than I might have liked. In our art authentication research service, we and most other people in this field follow what's called a three-pronged approach to attribution research. One is scholarship, which is provenance research and other documentary evidence that leads back to the artist. Materials examination, meaning the close examination with the conservator of the physical properties of a work of art. And when warranted, this includes lab testing, for example, to test the pigments, the binders, the canvas support, and whatever. And it may also include, and I'm sure increasingly in the future, it will start to include all sorts of computational techniques, mathematical and computer tools, whether this is fractal analysis, about which the jury is still out, and artificial intelligence, which we all hear so much about these days, and we all know is advancing at such a rapid speed. But the third prong of the research Connoisseurship, meaning close looking with experts, intimately familiar with a particular artist, is also crucial, and at times it is all that's necessary, even superior to other methodologies. We actually believe in it, so not in opposition, it's part of a process. Historically, science has been much better at ruling out than ruling in, meaning it allows you to eliminate works whose materials are, for example, anachronistic. It couldn't have been done by that artist at that time. But it's been very rarely able to prove that a work is authentic. These days, traditional connoisseurship gets, I guess, what might be called a bum rap. It's said to be old-fashioned and too subjective. People, I think, forget sometimes that science can also be subjective, which tests to do and how to interpret them. And also baseline data, comparative data isn't always available. Some of the newer computational techniques, and my guess is this will come up later, can be pretty accurate. IFAR is currently helping, actually, on an AI experiment. It's not finished, but the AI scientists did just let us know that a painting that we declared years ago to be a fake was also judged a fake by these AI tools to a 98% accuracy. That's a pretty good statistic. So down the road, AI, as it develops more, may indeed alter this landscape. I should point out, though, that we were sure this work was a fake the minute we saw it. So bottom line, this program is not anti-science, it's not anti-high-tech, nor, however, is it about the new tech. The people speaking tonight, our great specialists tonight, are in the art field. These are not technicians. This is only an evening. It's not a multi-day conference. The program is about connoisseurship and what it, and if you want, traditional connoisseurship, and what it can and perhaps cannot do. I once planned a major IFAR conference about the new technologies available to aid in the study of art and how they can work in tandem with the other approaches, whether curatorial partnerships and connoisseurship and whatever else. But we were still seeking funding when the pandemic intervened, and so this program is way on the back, got put on the back burner. I like to think of this evening as maybe one small component of that conference. Now, for tonight's logistics. We have 4, as you know, fabulous speakers, really terrific speakers for you. And they will speak in the sequence in which they're currently seated, starting from my far left, your far right, John Elderfield, Kate Gans, Carmen Melian, and David Friedberg. I will introduce each of them later as they get up to speak, so as not to be up here so long. Each will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion amongst us, and this will be followed by audience Q&A. So please hold your questions to the end, and and we will include, of course, the virtual attendees in that Q&A. After the program, we'll break for a reception. And please note that the Scandinavia House, this lovely venue that we've used many times before, is keeping its restaurant open for us. They are normally closed on Monday evenings, so this is a very nice gesture on their part. So please repay that gesture, and if you are going to eat afterwards, I suggest you eat there. And with no further delay, I'm going to now start the actual program by introducing our very first speaker, John Elderfield, who is one of the, let's just say, brightest stars in the curatorial firmament, and I'm proud to say a member of IFAR's Art Advisory Council. Dr. Elderfield is the former chief curator of paintings and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He's now curator emeritus at MoMA and an independent curator. He's curated numerous exhibitions, too many for me to name here, but they include a major retrospective on Matisse and one on Cézanne's portraits. He's also a special consultant to the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation and the de Kooning Foundation, and has curated exhibitions on those artists as well. I could go on, but that would take the whole evening. So without any further delay, I very proudly present to you John Elderfield.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. And let me begin with this illustration of two amateur connoisseurs judging a painting in a gallery. The joke, of course, depends upon readers of The New Yorker knowing what a painting by Pollock and Pollock himself looks like. And it has the added attraction for seasoned visitors to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, knowing that this painting does not look like a real Pollock. A reminder that among the functions of museums is that they can educate the eye. Okay, so let me make it a little bit more difficult. Which of these works, if either one, is a work by Pollock? The answer is that the work on the right is a Pollock made in 1951, and the work on the left is a de Kooning made in 1949. The clue is the continuous density of the soaked-in lines and patches poured onto an absorbent substrate in the Pollock, and the varied density of them spread and dripped on slick paper substrate in the de Kooning. Close looking at a reproduction of the de Kooning gives us a hint of its layering. See some of it on the left, but that is only visible in close looking at the work itself. So now we've seen what a beautiful 1949 de Kooning looks like. Which of these images, if either one, shows a work by de Kooning made in the 1960s? I think it soon becomes clear that the work on the left, in its own way, is as much a carefully composed drawing made with a purpose as the 1949 one, whereas the one on the right is a display of de Kooning-esque scribbling, and skills in connoisseurship are developed by making comparisons like this one. Now, this being an IFAR event, we are tempted to think of connoisseurship mainly as an aid to authentication, whether a work is genuine or fake, or by someone else than its purported artist. I shall be suggesting it has a broader function, but let me remain for the moment with authentication by going back about 40 years when I learned a very salutary lesson on this subject. And the lesson was, be suspicious not only of something feebly inept, like the fake de Kooning, but also of something that seems to be too beautifully perfect. And this concerned a work called Blauer Vogel on the left, which I included in my 1985 Schwitter's retrospective, and may still be found in a Google search for his collages. I knew it from Bill Rubin's 1968 book, Dada and Surrealist Art, where it's dated 1922, and its word content discussed in detail. The heavy air, he on the top left, and the arrow pointing to the more elegant she, where Schwitt and Hanover, near the top where Schwitters lived, and Oosturm at its top right, referring to the Sturm Gallery where he exhibited, and so on. But when I saw it in the exhibition with other collages, like these two, I had a sinking feeling that all this wordplay was too good to be true. The first thing I did was check that date from part of a desk calendar at the bottom, Sonntag 23. And yes, a Sunday did fall on the 23rd of one month in 1922, but so it did in a number of later years. I therefore asked a researcher to check as many of the other legible parts as possible. And the clue was the fragment of a tram ticket next to the engraving of the soubrettes at a masked ball. The wavy lines are part of the weather forecast information that was once printed on German tram tickets, but not until decades after the collage supposedly was made. Now, it was research that demonstrated this work was not right, but the research was prompted by the hunch called connoisseurship that it was too good to be true. Since then, I've worked a lot on Matisse, so periodically I'm sent images of his paintings of uncertain attribution. Among them, one of these works said to have been painted in the teens. Of the three, I think the work at the center is the most patently accomplished, a beautifully constructed painting, whereas the other two seem unfinished in their different ways. But what we have here is a work by an extremely talented follower of Matisse between two genuine paintings by Matisse himself. Another painter, Bryce Marden, spoke of Matisse's surface as a work surface, adding, he leaves changes, he shows you how to make the paintings. The work at the center is perfected and finished, too good to be true. The others show you how they were made. Now, I mention Marden because artists were the first advisors to those amateurs of art from whom connoisseurs and then art historians descended. Albrecht Dürer reportedly said that only artists can judge art. For all others, it's a foreign language. It's certainly a visual language to be learned, which we can only learn if we give a great deal of time and attention to looking at works of art. A new publication by a man called David Stork, who's a Stanford professor, called Pixels of Painting, Foundations of Computer-Assisted Connoisseurship, correctly points out that because enlightened museums allow their works to be scanned, computer algorithms can see more artworks than any human can in thousands of lifetimes. Of course, they cannot choose among those artworks which ones make you suspicious, but it does seem fair to agree with him that image processing can aid in attribution and in the detection of fakes. But with two provisos. First, it is pixels of paintings that are being processed, not the paintings themselves. And second, with the rapid growth of artificial intelligence portals, can you be sure that the pixels being processed are of an actual painting or are being used to construct one? Paintings are made with the aid of the human eye and to be seen by the human eye under normal conditions of sight. And this raises the question perhaps for another IFAR session on how paintings not made with the aid of electric light should be displayed and reproduced. But this subject pertains to connoisseurship insofar as we do want to see what the artist saw in completing a painting. When I worked on a Bonnard exhibition, when I worked on a Bonnard exhibition, I learned that the artist liked to look at his paintings in what he called the blue hour, when light was fading. It's called the blue hour because in bright sunlight, reds and oranges visually advance, while blues and violets recede, whereas in dawn or dusk, the opposite is true. It's impossible to see what Bonnard saw in reproductions of his paintings, or indeed in most museums which have expelled natural light for its variability. Happily, the Phillips collection has its Bonnards in a gallery with windows, and was persuaded to let a curator show them to my wife and me one late afternoon with the lights turned off. Under electric light, which is when this image of the 1926 painting, The Palm, was taken, the blue-violet figure in the foreground appears strangely distant and out of focus. As in the gallery, the light faded beyond a critical point, the curator gasped in astonishment as the image of the figure suddenly sharpened and visually advanced until it resembled a hologram hovering over the surface. I suppose that computer-assisted connoisseurship could show the figure changing, but that cannot be like being in the room with it when that transformation occurs. Therefore, cannot share the experience that Bonnard experienced while looking at the paintings. Connoisseurship, in the broadest interpretation of that term, pertains not mainly to questions of right and wrong, but more broadly to the appreciation and understanding of works of art, what Michael Baxendale had called the picturing mind at work. There are, of course, plenty of topics to be interested in as an art historian, from artists as individuals, to the societies in which they belong, to histories of patronage, the critical reception of artists' works, its interpretation by theoretical structures, and so on, and the teaching and practice of academic art history still seems to range more readily across topics like that, rather than on the character, evolution, and workings of an artistic practice. However, that is basic to connoisseurship in its broader sense and takes you out of the classroom and the library into museums and galleries. At this point, even though there's a Princeton curator in the audience here, I cannot refrain from reporting that I spoke with some Princeton students who were taking a course in Manet criticism and had never seen an actual Manet painting. Conversely, students who had some experience of making art or working with it in museums, galleries, and auction houses had a great advantage in tracing the picturing mind at work. And of course, curators who assemble exhibitions have the greatest advantage of all. My own experience is that for a monographic exhibition, be it of a full career or part of one, I begin by collecting with research help images of as many of the subject's works that I can. Then I go to see ideally twice the number of works I can show. And for my de Kooning show in 2012, which had 195 works, I did, in fact, I know, see more than 400. And there were return visits to the ones I wanted to borrow. It's a daunting process, but also a thoroughly satisfying and indeed privileged one. In fact, I can think of nothing more rewarding than this kind of activity for bringing the curator and ultimately the exhibition audience closer to the artist and to the processes of making art. Let me say in closing that obviously I'm a great believer in the importance of museums in making it possible for many people to look like connoisseurs, making careful, repeated viewings of paintings in their collections and exhibitions. Nonetheless, the question, is there a case for connoisseurship in a high-tech era, appears to have a very different answer when we see what looking entails at the most popular painting in the Western world. Thank you.
I have to say I had a chuckle when I saw John's first slide, because that very cartoon, and John neglected to say that cartoon was done by the comedian Steve Martin, so it has an extra, with a partner, it has an extra resonance. I have that very cartoon at my desk, and so does Lisa in my office. So the second we saw that cartoon, we fell in love with it as well. And your comment about the students at Princeton, I got my PhD at Columbia, and we used to joke that you could get a PhD at Columbia in the art history department never having seen an actual work of art. But I think things have changed over the years, and that's no longer true. So I resonate with your comments. Our next speaker is Kate Gans, whom I've already mentioned as a member of IFAR's board. She's an art historian who attended grad school at Columbia, where I met her many, many years ago, although we didn't really know each other. She is also a discerning collector with a distinguished collection of Old Master and also 19th and 20th century drawings. She spent many years as an art dealer, 30 years in London, with 2 successive galleries in the West End of London, for which she published 11 scholarly catalogs on the works in the gallery. And she also later had a gallery in New York, but she stopped her activities as a dealer in 2010 to work on the catalog raisonné of Jasper John's drawings for the Menil Foundation. As if that weren't enough, she was one of the scholars involved in the 1998 exhibition on the drawings of Annibale Carracci at the National Gallery in Washington. So I very proudly present to you Kate Gans.
Thank you, Sharon. And I would also like to thank the staff at IFAR, who helped me a great deal in preparing what I'm going to say tonight. I hadn't given this kind of lecture since I was a graduate student at Columbia in the 70s, which was a long time ago. And when I was told that I would need some slides, I said to David Friedberg, well, I'm not associated with any university. Could I come to Columbia Slide Room and pick my slides? And he said, you don't have to do that anymore, Kate. I would like to begin with 2 quotations and end with a third, and in between describe the process of attributing drawings by old masters. That is, drawings generally made before 1700. There is nothing closer to the truth than what the actual eye can tell you. Carmen Baumbach, a distinguished drawings curator, said to me in conversation several years ago. And as Leo Steinberg wrote in 1953, the eye is part of the brain and therefore inextricably involved in mysterious cerebral operations. The evaluation of Old Master drawings differs from that of later works for some obvious reasons. Objective kinds of information are not as readily available as they are for 18th, 19th, and century sheets, and 20th century sheets. Connoisseurship, with its objective criteria, must take on more of the burden of this subtle and complicated work. Earlier drawings are rarely signed and almost never graced with an inscription by a contemporary hand. Unless the artist was hugely famous in his lifetime, Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, Rembrandt, or Rubens, for example, a drawing's provenance can be relatively scant. Collectors' marks and records of a collector's inventory are not prevalent. Documents showing the acquisition or sale of the drawing occasionally exist, but they do not often record sales before the 18th century. Prints or drawn copies made after the image are invaluable, of course, but with more minor artists, these can be rare. So those of us who study Old Master drawings depend greatly on subjectivity, on what we simply see. Does the work of art look like other works by the artist? Does it have the same handwriting, by which we mean the way the hand distributes the medium on the support? Are the depictions of light, shade, and volume convincing? Can we depend on the fact that an artist's graphic handwriting changes remarkably little over time? The two drawings about which I'm going to speak have come through my hands in different ways. One from a private collector, the other purchased at auction. From an attribution point of view, neither of the drawings had any of the objective criteria described above. Both works were impressive in different ways, and both tantalizing in terms of connoisseurship. I first saw this drawing over 40 years ago. Taken by its beauty, I felt at once that it was an Italian drawing from the 17th century, and possibly by an artist whose drawings I had handled and whose graphic style was familiar to me, Guido Reni. One problem was that the work did not look like a typical Reni, either drawing or painting. And yet, something of his handwriting was unmistakably present on the sheet. The drawing is made with tempera and oil over black chalk. It is on two sheets of overlapping and joined paper, signifying a change in the composition at some time. This suggested to me that the drawing could be a cartoon, that is, a drawing made in preparation for another, possibly painted work. But there was no second work that I knew of this composition. Coupled with this conundrum, the medium was so unusual for Reni that all of the scholars to whom I wrote were skeptical that it could possibly be by him. I was unable to reach a definite conclusion about Reni's authorship. A breakthrough came when I was working in the Whit Photo Library in London and found a photograph of an 18th century print engraved after the painting that my cartoon depicted. The small inscription on the bottom left of the print clearly identifies the artist as Guido Reni and gives the subject as the mythological figure Erigone. Soon after I found the engraving, by chance, the painting itself came to light. In Greek myth, Erigone was the daughter of Icarius, and in this canvas, she is lifting a cloth away from a plate of grapes, not suspecting that Bacchus, disguised as the fruit, has arrived to seduce her. With the discovery of the painting, the authorship of the cartoon now seemed secure, but it remained to be explained how and where it was used. In 1623, the Duke of Manchester commissioned Reni to paint a toilet of Venus. This glorious, large canvas was instantly famous and was copied many times. It passed through 3 royal collections and was finally bequeathed to the National Gallery in London in 1836 by King William IV, where it resides to this day. It was some 10 years later, around 1633, that Reni was commissioned to paint this rather obscure subject from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It seems almost certain that at the time of the second commission, the artist turned to the figure of the handmaiden in his earlier painting, drew the cartoon, and used it as the basis for the new canvas. Here one can see the important adjustments in the figure's hands, now not holding Venus's crown, but the cloth that covers the serving plate where Bacchus lies in wait. The slide on the left shows the painting with the cartoon superimposed over the figure of the handmaiden. And one can see that the position of Erigone hardly varies from the original source. The use of this beautiful cartoon in two separate works over 10 years apart had not been previously documented. Cartoons are often destroyed in the process of transfer. The survival of a complete example is uncommon. The newly discovered cartoon provides us with a rare glimpse into Rainey's working methods. For those of you who are going to Europe in the near future, the Erigone cartoon is currently on view in a new Guido Reni exhibition at the Prado Museum in Madrid. The drawing I purchased at Christie's in January 1998 was cataloged, as you can see, as German school, early 19th century, the head of a young girl in profile to the left in Renaissance dress. The medium is pen and brown ink, gouache, and colored chalks on vellum. It is laid down on board. Although I had it in my gallery and studied it over a period of many years, along with museum curators, old master specialists, and collectors, I was never able to come up with an attribution that seemed closer to me than the original description of the drawing. The person to whom I sold the drawing in 2007, and several scholars and distinguished drawing scholars, and several serious and distinguished drawing scholars, now believe the drawing is by Leonardo da Vinci, an attribution that I considered originally, but had rejected as soon as I had lived with the work for a few days. Nothing at all is known of this drawing before I purchased it. It had no written or visual history whatsoever. It was never mentioned in any inventory or any of the extensive literature on Leonardo, or his patrons, or his subjects, either by contemporary or later biographers. No copies, drawn or engraved, existed. The sitter is not known, and in addition to this excessively rare situation, there was another conundrum. Leonardo seldom drew with colored chalks and virtually never used vellum as a drawing support. In the last several years, the portrait has amassed an impressive bibliography with books and articles discussing the Leonardo attribution, both pro and con. In the absence of any objective criteria for making an attribution to Leonardo, let us look briefly at the drawing itself and examine the subjective questions one might ask, comparing just a few details with known drawings or paintings by one of the most famous artists of all time. Does the anatomy work? The eye is an orb, a rounded globe, deep in a socket, with eyelids that protect it and close over it from top or bottom, such as in both the exquisite painted portrait of Cecilia Gallerani on the left in Krakow, and the beautiful drawing by Leonardo in the Louvre on the right. Unlike in the drawing in the Louvre, the eye in the Christie's drawing is not understood as an orb, but rather as an almost cone-shaped triangle that fits into the eye socket and sits on top of the lower lid. The lower lid is an awkward shape, acting as a plane that supports the iris rather than curving around the eyeball, as Leonardo has drawn it. Even given the fact that one purports to be a formal portrait and one an informal study drawn from life, the Louvre drawing shows a living, breathing young woman, while the sitter in the Christie's drawing appears motionless, with no sense of the atmosphere around her. Much has been made of the shading and the use of small parallel left-handed strokes around the profile on the left. And you know that Leonardo was left-handed, and that every time a drawing with left-handed strokes appears, everyone says it's by Leonardo. I just point out what I'm talking about? This part here. Does the shading in the detail enhance the drawing in any way? These small parallel strokes appear to have no function. They seem gratuitous to the image, telling us nothing about the sitter or about where she sits. In contrast, the soft left-handed shading in the Turin drawing on the right, sorry, you can't really see it in the slide. It's been blown up so much. I apologize. Creates volume with shadows and light and places the gently turning head in space. Over 4,000 drawings by Leonardo have come down to us, but only a very few show a female figure in profile. Here's the drawing that is the closest in every respect to the drawing of the young lady from Christie's. Although these two profile drawings may at first seem similar, if one looks closely, significant differences begin to emerge. The lines in the profile on the left are searching and changing. Leonardo subtly corrected the drawing again and again, each minute change altering the position of the sitter's head, while he attempted to find the contour of her face, the length of her neck, and the shape of her skull, which he drew several times. None of this is present in the drawing on the right. Our subjective opinions in attributing drawings are connected with an infinity of things we feel we know and the mysterious cerebral operations that Steinberg cites. Our work requires persistence, patience, and intuition. Our attributions are not wild guesses, but thoughtful conclusions, and of course, sometimes they are wrong. But because they are not based on provable things, they also cannot be pieced together from facts. I believe it will be critical to keep this in mind when we discuss the role of connoisseurship in the age of artificial intelligence. Let me end with something Leonardo himself wrote. Time will destroy the harmony of human beauty in a few years, but this does not occur with such beauty imitated by the painter, because time will long preserve it. And the eye, in keeping with its function, will derive as much true pleasure from depicted beauty as from the living beauty denied to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was actually terrific. And it sort of underscores what connoisseurship is. It's close looking, and as John also said. Now we're going to move on. And let me say, it didn't seem right that we would only have specialists in Western European art represented on this program. So we wanted to have someone who could not only address a different period of art, but also someone who had been part of the auction world and appraisal world. So I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Carmen Melian, who is a specialist in Latin American and Spanish colonial art. Carmen spent approximately 15 years until 2014 at Sotheby's in New York as senior specialist and as the director of the biannual Latin American auctions. And she's currently an adjunct professor and visiting lecturer at the Sotheby's Institute. And she heads her own fine art consulting and appraisal firm. So let me gladly introduce to you Carmen Melian.
Hello. I'm Carmen Melian. I'm currently an appraiser and an art advisor. I serve on the board of the Appraisers Association of America. And I have a background which is a little bit different from my esteemed colleagues who come from academia and the gallery world. I started out as a dyslexic art student, and it gives you a different eye about how hard it is to do a certain line and how hard it is to do a print. And then I went on to the gallery world, where I worked at the Nora Jaime Gallery with living artists. These artists became your friends. You learned to stretch their canvases. You learned their foibles. Their work became your friend. And then I had the great honor or privilege to work at Sotheby's for 14 years, where the sheer volume of work you are exposed to, as Professor Elderfield was saying, teaches you something, because you don't learn from books. You do learn from books, but you learn from actually seeing the works. You learn from touching them. You learn what kind of backing a certain artist used. They become your friends. It's like recognizing a friend. You can recognize a certain line. You certainly hit the books. You have the privilege of speaking to many collectors who have worked in a certain area for most of their lives. They share their stories. They've known the artists. They know a lot of anecdotes. And it makes the paintings come alive. And I feel that I've been very blessed in having that experience and all these other experiences. I get to meet wonderful academics. I had a wonderful exposure to a large library, and I've seen connoisseurship change over time. Now you can look at things up on Google. You don't have to go to the New York Public Library and search and search and search. But there is nothing like actually seeing and feeling the works of art. Some of my friends have called me a little bit of a Helen Keller, because I go and I start touching the canvas and I don't get horrified. But it gives you a certain feeling for work that you don't get from a book, as both of my colleagues have said. I'm going to start with one of the best known artists in the world, Frida Kahlo. You recognize her whether you know about art or not. And she's the woman, she's the legend, and she's the artist. Well, to me, she's the artist. I've always looked at her as a performance artist who created everything around her, as well as her work. And most people think that she was very she's a naive artist, and she wasn't. She was highly trained, actually, in the studio of Besmogar in Mexico City, who advocated a very Renaissance-like technique. If you look at her very early works, they look almost Renaissance. She had a tiny, tiny little brushstroke. She was very careful. A lot of her work is very small because it took a lot of time. And there's a lot more to her beyond the myth. She was fluent in English and French, well, German, Spanish. She wrote beautifully. She wrote poetry. And she kept the books for both her and her husband, Diego. She managed an international household. She was quite a woman and quite an artist. This is one of the Fridas you do know. She had a very small production, about 150 paintings during her lifetime. This is called, this is not the best slide. This is called La Venadita, the little deer. It's actually tiny, it's about this big. A lot of her work is very detailed, and she portrays herself as a little deer who's being hurt, but she's still running through the forest, pierced by many arrows. And It is one of her self-portraits, which are the best known of her works, but only a third of her production were self-portraits. There was a lot more to her. Of course, then you have this. Exactly. When you focus just on the self-portraits, you think, well, that's all she ever did. And of course, as with most artists, when they become very popular, other things start to come forward. This work was actually offered on eBay about 20 years ago, and it sold for a lot of money. The photo is courtesy of Marianne Martin, Fine Art, who has a wonderful file of works attributed to Frida. But if you look at this, an untrained eye, oh, it's a Frida, that's her portrait, that must be her. Artists paint things for a reason. She painted this for a reason. There's a reason for the subject. There's a reason for the imagery. There's no reason for this imagery. None whatsoever. She thought of herself as a strong woman. She was a strong woman. She traveled all over the world. She did not think of herself as a turkey. And a turkey with a tremendously badly drawn neck. And so we used to have, when I was at Sotheby's, we used to call what we had the Frida of the Week. And some of them could possibly, maybe. A lot of them, no way, Jose. And there was a wonderful letter, 5-page, both sides written, very serious letter, sent with photographs. And it was, the photograph was of a pig, a penny, what are those called? Piggy banks. And there was a 5-page rationale, front and back, very seriously written about why this was a Frida. Because Mexicans like to eat pork, and it went on and on and on and on, and we had it actually framed for a while. But you have to understand the artist. Artists do paint or create for a reason. It's either their life, it comes from their life, it comes from what they're looking at, it comes from who's around them, and I don't think she was surrounded by turkeys. This is the Frida you don't know. As I said, her iconic paintings are all self-portraits, but they're only a third of her paintings. And she also did prints, she did drawings, she did illustrated letters, she did watercolors. And this is a real Frida. It doesn't appear in the literature. It's an early work from 1929. And when you first look at it, you think, no, this is not it. And then you start to look at it closely when you physically have the painting in front of you, and you start to see her technique, that those minute little brush strokes, the shading, the way the sitter is posed. It's very typical. She and Diego Rivera were very big collectors of 19th century Mexican genre paintings and portraits. Her father was a photographer, a portrait photographer, amongst other things. She was his assistant, and this is a very sort of formally posed portrait. She, like many artists, were starving artists, and they take on commissions. This is done very early. This is an American school teacher called Miriam Pinansky, and she was visiting relatives in Mexico, and a friend of a friend of a friend, knew Frida, and her relatives in Mexico said, oh, have your portrait painted. And the portrait went back to Wisconsin. It's done in 1929. Frida is probably 28 at the time. Again, I'm dyslexic. And once you really see the painting, it really could be. And it was Professor Salomon Grimberg, who is a great specialist in Frida, studied this, and he followed the paperwork. It took him a couple of years, but he followed the paperwork, and he followed the back of the painting is consistent with her work. Of course, she wasn't as popular at auction, but this is the other Frida. I wanted to show this work because it taught me humility. Amongst many other works have taught me humility. The more you see, the more you know. The more you see, the more you know you don't know. And this is the work, oh God, that's really awful, by Mario Carreño, who was a member of the Vanguardia movement, which is the Cuban vanguard of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. This was a movement that was highly faked in the 1990s. This is a very problematic, still to this day, very problematic area because there are very limited or no catalog raisonnés. Everything has been cut off from Cuba. There was a lot going on in Miami of, oh, well, this just fell off the boat. You know, it came from the National Museum, and there was a lot of speculation. This was brought to us by a picker and had no provenance. We looked at it, we looked at it, we looked at it, and we were very careful with Cuban works of art from this period at that time. And it was consistent with his work, the background, the trees, the way he did the horses, the river. But we had nothing to back it up. We had a gut feeling, we thought it was right, seemed right with his neoclassical period. And then we went to the Pearls archives. He showed with the Pearls Gallery on Madison Avenue with Klaus Pearls in the 1940s. And lo and behold, there was the painting in one of the photographs, but they're bald. And when we had been looking at this painting, we had been thinking, you know, everything has the right texture except for the hair, which seems very flat and glossy. And at some point, it could have been Klaus Pearl saying, listen, I don't want to show this work, add some hair. It could have been the next owner who didn't want two bald people on his wall and painted the hair in. But that's the way the painting is now. And again, the more you know, the less you know. So we still don't know. Sharon asked me to speak a little bit about connoisseurship and the auction market. She said, how do you know if it's a great Diego Rivera? Because then you hear about a great Cézanne, and you keep looking and you keep learning. And there is a difference. Then we had a conversation about a painting you need to admire and the painting that you want to hang in your wall, which is a whole different subject. This is a great Diego Rivera. Great, great, top quality. This is Diego Rivera, the great Cubist painter. He lived in Paris. He lived in France, actually, for about 20 years. And this is at the National Gallery of Art, Spanish Still Life in 1915. He was there. He wasn't a second-generation Cubist painter. He was a first generation. He was friends with Picasso. Of course, they fought. You get two bulls in the same room. And then Rivera accused Picasso of stealing his technique on something, and then they fought, and then they got back together, and anyway. But they had the same dealer. And this belonged to Mrs. Graham's parents, who were great collectors, the Meyers. And it's large, it's very beautiful. You can tell it's not a Picasso. He didn't, he signed differently. Diego Maria Rivera, DMR. And you will find a great Cubist painting by Rivera at MoMA, You will find it at the Met. You will find it at the National Gallery. But you won't find it in most people's houses unless they are great specialists of Rivera and know all of his career. His Cubist period was short. He felt he was way too constricted by the lack of color, because he had an amazing, like Matisse, an amazing sense of color. He just felt cubed in, and he went to Rome, and then he went back to Mexico. This will sell for $1 million, and probably a good bit more. But market-wise, it won't compare to this. This is a Diego Rivera, a girl with lilies, or flower vendor. He did a whole series of them. It's in the collection of the Norton Simon. And it was the gift of Cary Grant, the actor. What people forget was that Diego Rivera in the 40s and 50s was the Andy Warhol of his time. He came to town, big banner in the newspaper, famous Mexican artist arrives, and he was feted all over town. He was the vanguard in the 30s and the 40s. I don't know if any of you saw the wonderful exhibition, Vida Americana at the Whitney, how Mexican art influenced North American painting, social realism, blah, 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 blah. And he was a huge deal in his time. He was the second artist to have a one-person exhibition at MoMA after Matisse. And this painting, obviously, when Rivera went back to Mexico, but already as a mature artist in his 40s, he went to rediscover his indigenous roots, the way Picasso went to look at neoclassical sculpture and painting, and he had great success with American clients. And this is probably the most expensive type of Rivera that you will see, because everybody wants water lilies. Everybody wants, calla lilies. Everybody wants an indigenous girl, especially now. The connoisseurship on both paintings is the same. It's a matter of market. And to me, when Sharon said, what is the connoisseurship at auction? How does that change? How do you know the difference? Well, one, you have to know the market, what the current market is, what the current like of the market is, because I've been in the market long enough to see Impressionist and modern be the most important and the most expensive paintings, to shift to now everything's contemporary. And that there are two different things to me. One is market connoisseurship, and one is painting connoisseurship. And that's a whole different subject. But, well, one day will AI be able to tell the difference? Well, maybe depends on the metrics and what it's fed as far as market information. Will it be able to tell the difference between two great art, great paintings within the same artist? That I don't know. Anyway, that's what I've got. Thank you.
Last is certainly not least. Some people, and thank you very much, Carmen. I really found that interesting to see. I didn't realize that the lilies of Diego Rivera were so much more valued than the other art. Any case, some people need no introduction. And I think our next speaker, David Freeberg, is one of them, but I'll try anyway. David is the Pierre Matisse Professor of the History of Art at Columbia and the director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies, also at Columbia. Before then, he was director of the Warburg Institute in London. And he was at other places as well. In some ways, it's difficult to list his accomplishments because they vary so much. But among other things, he's the author of numerous books, really a lot of books, and known particularly for his publications on iconoclasm and also the power of images. He's a scholar in the fields of Dutch and Flemish art, but also other periods as well. He still works in those areas, but his more recent focus has been on the relationship between art and history and cognitive neuroscience. He's also written a lot about connoisseurship, the subject tonight. All this means that you're really in for a treat, and for those of you who've heard David Friedberg speak, you know what I mean. So I very happily give you David Friedberg.
Thank you, Sharon. You know, I'm deeply committed to this topic. We've heard a lot about Princeton abandoning the looking at pictures, and now Columbia has been aligned with Princeton as well. And I'm here to say that I've actually taught the history of art. This is my 50th year of full-time teaching, and I've never abandoned the study of connoisseurship. I think connoisseurship is one of the central elements of our discipline. And it should never cease to be. I want to begin, though, perhaps with a small correction of our title. Is there a case for connoisseurship in a high-tech era? Well, in a way, the case is already settled. I don't know of any connoisseurs now, perhaps on the market, well, I think even on the market. There are no connoisseurs now who are not involved with high-tech of one kind or another. No connoisseurs cannot look at the evidence of infrared reflectography, for example. I mean, we've been involved with the tech of X-rays, infrared, and so on. But for years, we've been we've made extensive use of these ancillary scientific disciplines. Even, you know, for 20 years ago, we were already using nuclear autoradiography to see what we could of the underdrawing of Rembrandts, which of course are not susceptible to X-ray examination. So I think, you know, one of the things which I've learned, one of the aspects of my work with paintings, sculptures, artworks of all kinds, has been what I've learned from the conservators in museums. I think we all agree that we must look harder, that we must take our students to look at pictures more, but we also need the advice from those people who have daily contact with the matter, the materials of the objects which are made. And so, you know, we're pretty high tech already. There's plenty of spectrography available and so on. AI is an entirely different matter, and as is clear we all agree that we need to get more involved with AI but this is not so much a matter of high tech, but this is a matter of computational, I think Sharon mentioned this at the beginning, matter of big data, computational techniques which are beyond the reach of most of us. So we will soon be working with people who are involved in working with thousands and thousands and thousands of millions of bits of information that enable these processes of deep learning, which will further facilitate judgments about pictures, because we have so much information that is at our disposal. Now, when I was invited to talk, I reflected on the fact that in the last 2 years, I have been more inundated with questions about the authenticity of works of art than ever before. I thought I'd left all that behind in London when I left the Courtauld in 1984. You know, in London, one always was talking to the people involved in the trade, and because then I was working on Rubens, there were plenty of Rubenses and sub-Rubenses, and one was always called in to pass judgment on a picture, and the English nobility took you up to their country houses, to Castle Howard, to you know, the endless numbers, Ickworth and so on and so forth. There were plenty of those, and one was always being dragged up there to pass judgment on paintings. And one did this rather tentatively, certainly at that age, when I was young and beginning, and I realized that one needed more information. So this is why actually, having spoken of the abundance of data that is now capable of being collected, I think we really need to attend to what we will learn from people who are skilled with math, which most of us are not, at least in this room. But as I said earlier, I began this lecture because I began thinking about this lecture, and I produced a whole load of images with examples of the puzzles which I had faced. But I realized that I wanted to say something more about the background to connoisseurship. I've always taught connoisseurship. As I've said, I've taught it even in the most ideologically trendy of times, throughout the years of Clarkian, by which I mean Tim Clark, not Lord Clark. Throughout the years of Clarkian social history of art, of semiotics, the rise of feminism, and the current academic obsessions with diversity, I've thought that connoisseurship, as practiced by, we've emphasized this enough, the exercise of the eye, remains extraordinarily important. It's obviously an elitist sounding denomination. The notion of a connoisseur suggests that we're somehow detached from the rest of the less elite humanity, but this is absolutely not the case. There's nothing more essential to the understanding of art, not only of art, but of history as well, of the documents of history. And if I have time, I was going to show you, I probably won't have time, Sharon will cut me off before I get to a book by Galileo, but we'll come to that perhaps later on or not, as the case may be. But I have constantly been reminded, both in my own work, but also by colleagues, of whom the most distinguished is probably Carlo Ginzburg. You remember the wonderful author of the greatest historian of our age, the author of The Cheese and the Worms. That's an unforgettable title. If you haven't read it, go and read it right away. And Carlo has always insisted that to be a good historian, you need to be able to tell what is false and what is not false. It's a very simple rule. And that, I think, is one of the aims of connoisseurship. But it's not the only aim. It's true that it's come to the fore into this evening's talks, and in our day and age, it has a lot to do with the matter of authentication. But let me remind you that although, of course, Chinese culture had long been involved with theoretical connoisseurship, long before the arrival of the man, I'm just going to say, who was the first connoisseur? When I'm teaching, I always offer a glass of champagne to someone who can answer this question. So if anyone knows who was the first connoisseur in Western art, it's later than you would think. Okay. Well, I don't know about Vasari, whether he could pass as a connoisseur, but no one was the first theoretical connoisseur we had was Jonathan Richardson. And let me remind you, Jonathan Richardson, you know, he wrote this tripartite book in 1792, the first part, The Theory of Painting, the second part, Essay on the Art of Criticism, part 3, The Science of the Connoisseur. So already in 1792, Jonathan Richardson was saying, okay, you can judge quality, but it's a scientific activity. And he made an important distinction, because when you think about connoisseurship, there are really at least two aspects at stake. The first one are judgments of quality, and the next one is judgments of attribution and authenticity. So this appears in Jonathan Richardson already. The next step, and actually it's quite interesting, no, I'll come to this later on. The next step, I would say, which was really important, was that made by a name with which most of you will probably be familiar, that great Italian who went for a long time masqueraded under a Russian name. You know, Ivan Lermoliev was the Russian name that Giovanni Morelli, it was really called Giovanni Morelli, gave himself. And his book, his great book, was, of course, around the famous Venus in the Dresden Gallery. And the question was, Titian or Giorgione? And how did he tell whether it was by Titian or Giorgione? Of course, he came on the side of Giorgione, and this is how he did it. This is really, really, really critical. One of the do you all know this, by the way? Yes. So you all know this now. But the point about all of this is that you know about the heirs of these different artists. The point about this was you went after not that which artists did consciously, but what they did unconsciously. So the sort of little individual tics that people have, those were the things which you thought out, which you were thinking of consciously. You didn't think about your schooling. You didn't think about how to do a tear duct. You might have thought about how to do a tear, but the tear duct you just did swiftly, and this is what he tried to show. I mean, it's actually quite difficult, as you can even from a distance see, to actually make the distinctions between Filippo Lippi's hands and Filippino's hands and so on. But you get the idea. And Morelli, of course, was, so you have Jonathan Richardson, 1792, Morelli, the Werke Italienische Maler in the galleries in Dresden of 1880. And then, of course, comes Berenson, who really made use of Morelli in the first of the collected regional studies was the Venetian painters of the Renaissance, 1894, Florentine painters, 1896. So all this is quite bunched together. And then along came Carlo Ginzburg, who I mentioned earlier, much, much later, in a very famous essay called Spear, meaning clues. He pointed out the really interesting connection between Morelli and Jonathan Richardson, but Morelli in particular. So Morelli is 1888, and then Freud 2 years later with the interpretation of dreams. And so, of course, and the whole business of the lapsus, those mistakes which you make unconsciously, this parallel between, and that identifies you in all your individuality. So there was this remarkable coincidence at the end of the 1880s, beginning of the 1890s, between this new paradigm, which were the traces left by the artist unconsciously on the canvas, and thereby you might be able to establish who did what. And so for Ginzburg, I think this was also a way of thinking about the authenticity of documents, which have become more and more important. You remember, of course, the great stumbler, Hugh Trevor Roper, who thought he had found Hitler's diaries, published the diaries, and then somebody noticed that some of the language was just ever so slightly less idiosyncratic than Hitler's might have been. So let me go on. So here is one of the first puzzles I had. So this picture, you all recognize it, you think you do, the lute player. Now I cannot do what John, Kate, my time will run out very soon, cannot analyze each of these, but I want to show you the bewildering quantity of material that one is confronted even now. The descendant of a very famous, the owner's very famous German castle came to me with, no, that wasn't them. A dealer came to me. I'm going to get to that prince later on. But a dealer came to me with this painting. And of course, we all think we have seen it before. Oh. So we all think we've seen it before. We know we have seen it before because there's a very similar picture in the Hermitage. And then there's another picture which floated around the market with Wildenstein for a while. None of you could tell the difference from this distance, but I can tell you, you go and look at them and you really have to squint. You really have to look through the layers of varnish if you can. It's not a very good slide there, but what I want to do in the remaining time is just to give you a sense of the abundance of material. So here is the new picture, there is the Hermitage picture. I think you probably, even in these poor slides, can see that the one on the right just intuitively is better. I use the definition on my slides, to use Kate's surviving term. The definition is not so good, but I think you can see very clearly that the picture on the right is a bit better than the over-polished picture on the left. And when you get up, you worry about the relative slickness, a bit like John's. One thing is slick, one seems to be more deeply absorbed into the picture. But these, of course, are subjective judgments. I want to say that one of the great debates in the history of connoisseurship has been that between deliberation and the premier coup d'oeil. In other words, the first sight of an image. What is your intuition? One of the reasons I've become interested, one of the many reasons I've become interested in neuroscience is because the neuroscience of intuitive judgment is now highly developed. And so the whole question, and of course you can also read it in Daniel Kahneman's books, Thinking Swiftly, what's it called? Thinking, Daniel Kahneman, somebody help me here. Thinking slowly, thinking swiftly. At any rate, there's the question of what is the reliability of your intuitive judgment? And as we know, our intuitive judgments tend to be the ones that in the end are correct. And we don't really know why. But obviously we have to submit those to the kinds of controls about the swiftness of judgments we make. So just to go on with this, so you see that it really becomes puzzling. How do you sort this out? So that's one Caravaggio. This rather improbable and ugly picture is actually quite well documented. St. John drinking at the well. It's hard to imagine such a composition being by Caravaggio, but the hands look pretty good. So there you have to think, is it possible, just as in the case of Carmen Stork, is it possible that Caravaggio could have painted a picture like this? I'm afraid this is an atrocious slide. This is the last of my Caravaggio examples, which the famous picture, this is a version from, it doesn't say, I better not mention which castle in Germany, but of course, most of you know that there's one in the Capitoline and one in the Doria Gallery on the right. Scholars still haven't figured out which is which. Now, Caravaggio was not copying himself. He may have had students who were copying him, who were copying him, he certainly did. But here, so there is the picture in the German castle, and the one on the right is in the Doria, and then the one on the right, again, the German picture, and the one on the right in the Capitoline. These are really bewildering judgments you need to get right up front. I did have the good fortune, finally, I was totally bewildered when I saw these. I knew the Italian pictures, the Roman pictures, but I hadn't seen the German picture. Then it turned out to be in the storeroom in Manhattan. I went to see it, and it was absolutely clear that this picture was even more deprived of any kind of, not depraved, more deprived in terms of the impasto than of the other pictures. Now, we don't normally think, of course, of impasto in association with Caravaggio, but you really can see the difference if you go to the work itself. There's no way in which you could tell this from a photograph, as we've already discussed. So let me just look at one or two, you see. They look identical. I mean, there's nothing that would help you figure out which was Caravaggio or not just by looking at these illustrations. So I remind you of the ancient debate about the Madonna of the Rocks, still not entirely resolved, but actually with these the slightly exaggerated distinctions between the Paris picture on the left and the National Gallery picture on the right, it's hard not to incline. I mean, when you look at these pictures, it's hard not to, these are subjective judgments, but it's hard not to incline to the Paris picture than the London picture, and it's hard to incline to the Salvator Mundi. I have tried to convince myself, I know that claims have been made that Leonardo finished the hands and so on and so forth, but we really have to use common sense. That was before it was cleaned. That was after it was cleaned, as you know, here in New York. So actually, you know, there's a lot of discussion about whether the hands may be slightly better, but actually, but those hands were there right at the beginning. The restorations were of other less significant parts of the picture, possibly the eyes. So let me move on to something entirely different. I had to give a lecture just in September at the Cini Foundation, San Giorgio Maggiore, in Venice. And here is the great supper at Cana by Veronese in the Louvre. And here is, it looks a bit bluer than it actually, this is a bad image also, but this is the digitized copy which was made of the picture in the Louvre, which of course was stolen from the church by Napoleon, was stolen from the church of San Giorgio Maggiore. It's really difficult to see the difference until you go up to the painting in San Giorgio Maggiore. And what's so misleading about this is the digital processors have enabled them to repeat the impasto exactly as it is. You have the same thickness and so on. I'll end in a moment. Go up to the picture in the refectory of San Giorgio Maggiore, and it looks pretty good. And then you realize that there's something wrong with the ground. that they haven't got the texture of the canvas entirely right. So this is really an interesting problem, which takes us, as I think John certainly tried to do, takes us beyond the confines of connoisseurship. We can establish fairly easily, I believe, that this is a digital copy. They don't like to hear me say this. But what's so important for our discipline now is that when visitors go to San Giorgio Maggiore, or if they have the space in the Louvre in front, well, they have more space in the Louvre than they have in front of the Mona Lisa. Oh, here it is now, of course. So that's its original location. But what I want people to think about is that in these days in which we say that other cultures cannot understand, this is my concluding divergence from the subject of connoisseurship, other cultures cannot get the pictures that our Western cultures produce. And I want to say that what I'm about to say now applies to reverse as well. But anybody can feel a sense of involvement with that figure seen from behind because of the bodily movement that arouses a similar response within ourselves. And the ways in which Veronese thinks through the movements of his picture, the movements of, after all, what is a still picture, the way in which those movements give us a sense of what is actually happening in the bodies of those in the scene. And the fact that, you know, you see the woman looking out at you and you wonder what's going on. Look at all that banquet, which I'm keeping you from in the restaurant very shortly. It doesn't matter. This actually is the Louvre. This is the Louvre version. But you go in San Giorgio Maggiore, and the whole point of art is to get people involved as much as we can. So let's not lose sight of the value also of reproductions. If we want to establish the Eigenhändigkeit, the hand of the actual hand of the artist who painted it, that's one thing. And I think it's very important. It's important for us and for our students, not only because of art, in fact, even less because of art, but because it's important for us actually to figure out a way of establishing what documents are valid and what documents of civilization are not valid. And I just want to show one more example, which I promised to show you. We'll skip those paintings, fake, as you can see, Jim. But you know that. I wanted to say something about the Polish rider, but we'll skip that. We can perhaps talk in our discussion. So I got very involved in this book. The Siderius Nuncius, the great treatise by Galileo in which he established that his basic principles, that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the moon was not a beautiful shining orb, but was pitted, cracked, and creviced, and ruined. It has Galileo's signature there below. I'm going to end with this cautionary tale. It has the stamp of the Academy of Lynxes to which Galileo belonged. I went to see this book. I could see the train lines in the pages. In other words, the quality of the paper. It was definitely old paper. It wasn't rag paper. These are I held up the typography was perfect. These were the engravings, and then they thought that the book which I showed you was a proof copy with drawings by Galileo. Drawings by Galileo in there. A friend of mine, Horst Bredekamp, a great art historian, I was asked to comment on this. I said, I don't know about Galileo. He came, he was very excited. He published all the articles. He's got 10 labs in Germany to authenticate the paper, the ink, the whole thing. Wrote 4 books on the subject. When it finally transpired, that's another exciting story. Some of you may have read about it in the New Yorker. It finally transpired. How had this forgery been made? It had been made with the aid of 3D laser printing. So you got that beautiful, fine sinking into the paper of the typography. And so the paper was right. Very cleverly, they bound the whole thing together. The paleography expert in the museum, the Science Museum in Florence, in the Galileo Science Museum in Florence, was authenticated by the greatest expert on Galileo's handwriting. And yet the whole thing in the end turned out to be a forgery. So caveat emptor, if you're going to buy it, which would have been a rather expensive process. But we cannot even rely on the judgments of all the labs. So in the end, we are left with our own paltry judgment, the need to accumulate as much evidence as we can, but to remember that these objects still, in their original state, lost though they may be, are of enormous value to civilization. Thank you.
Based on these conversations, you have some thoughts because there were threads. These are very, very different, very interesting, I have to say, but very different talks coming at the subject from completely different angles, if you will. I'm struck, it came up in a couple of places. We just didn't have the time, and I had to choose a title for the program. But the issue of connoisseurship and quality is an issue that, frankly, I think is the one thing that probably is not going to be replaced by the computational equipment. I have great faith that these computational techniques will be helpful in the future. As I said, we've already tried to experiment with them. I think everyone is, and the sky's the limit in a way. But I doubt very much that it's going to be helpful with quality, which is an issue that comes up all the time in museums, and it comes up in the auction world, it comes up in the gallery world, and collecting and everything else. It's not just attribution, but within attribution, it's quality of particular works. If anyone has a comment about that, that's already come up. And also, where is connoisseurship going in an era where theoretical and sociological art history have kind of dominated in academia? Who is training connoisseurs? You know, who is training people to look? I just raised these questions as a discussion point. You yourselves may have other points of discussion, but if anyone wants to tackle those questions, I'm happy to have that start off. Silence.
Next question, please.
Next question. Now, I didn't even intend that to be a question. I thought of that as a jumping off point for a discussion. Well, choose your own, John. Do you have a discussion point that you'd like to follow with from these talks, your own as well as David's and Carmen's and Kate's? You all approach this so differently.
One is always reading reports about people who have acquired large numbers of works which turn out to be spurious and have been, just put on the market because the market is overheated. And, I don't know is there anything comparable to this in our master works? I mean, are there like lots of spurious things going around or not?
Well, I was hoping to convey that to you with my long elenco, my long list of Caravaggios, which suddenly landed on my desk in a very short space of time.
Yeah.
And it's a very good question to ask. And I think, obviously not to the extent of Pollock, but to some degree, yes, it is the market pressures. I think.
Well, as Sharon knows, we've gone through, the time I've been associated with IFAR projects, we've looked at lots and lots of particularly de Kooning drawings, which are coming all the way through. And in some cases, you don't even have to look, or hardly need to look.
Most cases.
And, that at times hilarious documentation. I think Sharon will remember some where the supposed documentation for works coming from 3 different galleries, they had letters which were typed on the same typewriter. And also supposedly from galleries from the 1940s whose addresses had zip codes. And as the FBI, in this, one great thing is thieves are generally really stupid. So this is help for us doing attribution work.
I just wanted to mention from the auction side, most major auction houses have a 5-year guarantee when you buy something. And the reason is old masters. Because the auction house sells the work, whatever the name is, based on outside expertise. And expertise changes and flows, especially with old masters. So that's why there's a 5-year guarantee.
I actually think the auction houses deserve a lot more credit than they're given. I mean, the experts at the auction houses are very sophisticated. They have to make decisions which have to do with enormous amounts of money. And my experience is that the experts at the auction houses are really excellent in general.
Some are better.
And I mean, I think
Some are better than others, and some of it take it more to heart, your baby, or you discover that this painting, at midnight you're flipping through the books and you discover that this painting hasn't been seen since 1940 and you get all excited. But you do have to make very quick decisions because it is a business and you have to feed the cycle of the sales. Old Masters is a little bit different. I remember working with somebody on a colonial piece with somebody from Old Masters, and she said, "Oh, the attribution, not the attribution." And I said, "It's by that famous painter, Anonymous." And, well, I saw that I said, "No, there are 5,000 million angels from Peru." You can't figure it out in 2 minutes.
But don't you think that what the auction houses need is some training in writing for the people who write the blurbs?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Starting with me.
I mean, they can begin by removing adjectives.
Oh, do you mean fine and rare? I no longer work for an auction house, but a lot of my friends do.
I think dealers, at least in Old Masters, are also undervalued. I mean, I can look at Jill. I mean, we look at literally hundreds, thousands of images every year. Images from auction houses, images from catalogs, images from dealers. We all go to museums all the time. I remember one week in March, just recently, I was away. I came back to our apartment, and there were 5 catalogs from Paris. It was just about to be the big sale week in Paris. And there were 3 catalogs from dealers and 2 catalogs from an auction house. And there were I actually looked, there were over 1,000 images just in those 5 catalogs, which I spent one afternoon looking at. I mean, we look at thousands of images. And I think we have very well-trained eyes. And I don't feel that the financial part is of any importance to me, really. I mean, it's wonderful to find a drawing that turns out to be more than you paid for it, but that's certainly not what I'm doing when I'm looking for beautiful old master drawings. And that's why, with the Leonardo, what I really would have hoped about the Leonardo is that it would have turned out to be right and not wrong, and it would end up in a museum. But as you could tell from my presentation, I feel there's just no way in the whole wide world that is by Leonardo, and every museum in the world has neglected to even go and see it. So that's sort of why it's still languishing in a vault in Switzerland after 17 years. I think that's sort of all you need to know, really.
Maybe while you're thinking of other points that you guys want to discuss, we'll take some hands that I see are raised. Yes.
I wanted to respond to Kate, who's worked so hard in Old Masters and also in Jasper Johns, and to hear what everyone thinks. In some ways, the dealer always was the expert because they were the ones seeing the most material. But what I see with the internet is that there's a kind of a distrust of information that comes from someone who has a vested interest. And that is simply a judgment call that people have to make. So that if I, like the Leonardo or the pictures that go through auction houses or things in my gallery, if I have a financial gain or loss that's attached to the object, it doesn't mean that I'm going to be dishonest in order to gain, I'm not going to say a painting's right and sell it to gain money. And I think there's been a lot of bad publicity in the art world in the last couple of years, starting with the Salvador O'Reilly blow up. And I have people come to me who feel that they can Google the situation and figure it out as fast as I can. But what you all have pointed out, which I think is so important, is there's no replacement for looking at the actual object.
And touching it.
And yeah, touching the back. We all used to joke that, you would look at the back of a picture before you looked at the front to find out the real information.
Or upside down.
It's challenging, but I think if we could show that expertise and connoisseurship is an evolving thing also. There often is no one answer, and things can change and things can evolve, but it's how to attach the financial aspect to it without losing objectivity.
It's going to be a little controversial. I have to say I was a little disappointed that we didn't talk about the future of connoisseurship.
Well,
where is it going?
so
I have my own opinion. I think it will be usurped by artificial intelligence. Almost no
Completely?
question whatsoever, actually. I can see it even in my day-to-day practice. Just look, used to look at a painting, if you didn't know what it was, if it was Caravagesque, you maybe thought French, you search on Google, you search, come up with Valentin, you come up maybe with an answer. Now, you can actually put in the URL that image, and it comes up with 100 images, more than 100. So the answer is sitting in maybe those images. Once it gets closer to human intelligence, you're going to be able to converse with a computer and have that exact conversation. I think it's a little Caravagesque. And a computer says, could it be German? All kinds of things like that can happen. So I do feel, it's not going to be 100%. It will be once we reach singularity, that when artificial intelligence reaches the level of human intelligence, then, of course, you all know about this. The best minds in the world have thought about this and warned the entire world that we have to be very careful about artificial intelligence, because once it reaches equality with us, it is able to teach itself. Then in 1 week, it's 1,000 times smarter, and 2 weeks, it's 100,000, 1,000,000 times smarter within a few months. Then what does it do with itself? Is the other question. If you say, I'm going to unplug you, it's going to say, did China unplug their computers? There's all kinds of, I think that it will, just getting back to the topic, it will usurp connoisseurship completely. No, there's still going to be questions of quality and that, but I think that core idea of connoisseurship will be taken over by a computer before probably a computer reaches human intelligence. Even though we know there's 200,000 things going on in our mind all at once, The computer, Watson, that beat Kasparov. Kasparov said it was like hitting a wall. It made 200 million calculations in 1 second. It graded all the moves on the chessboard. If it could do that 20 years ago, think what tomorrow is going to bring.
that's a rather bleak future.
Yeah, sorry, I said it was going to be controversial.
I don't know. It actually reminds me of something. Ernst van de Wettering, the great scholar who died not long ago, who headed the Rembrandt Research Project, gave 2 talks for IFAR. And in one of them, which was about 20 years ago, he actually made a comment that, because they had already gone around the world looking and x-raying and testing all the purported Rembrandts, the hundreds of purported Rembrandts, and he mentioned that they had discovered that in the ground, all the Rembrandts, not all the Rembrandts, only Rembrandt works and works from his studio had a particular quartz ground, that none of the fakes that they ever saw or later works had this quartz ground. And then he actually said, because I wrote this down just in case, that they had found, and they were talking, he was talking even about self-portraits, which people always assumed had to be by the artist and not by the studio, that they had found that both autograph and non-autograph paintings by Rembrandt came from the artist's studio, and they used the same materials, including the same bolt of cloth and the same quartz ground. They could only be distinguished, he said, by means of stylistic analysis and evaluation of quality. In other words, connoisseurship. I've never forgotten that statement that he made. Now, obviously, they weren't using AI 20 years ago, but nonetheless, they had come to conclusions where only the discernment and sometimes the disagreement of the specialists involved in the committee was the determining factor, because there was no other way, both in terms of scholarship or materials, that they could make the distinction. I just throw that in as a point because it references what you're saying. Whether the AI can completely replace that down the road, I don't know. Anyone have a thought about that? Nope.
Well, I just want to make a quick, I love dropping the image in, by the way, in Google Images, and I find all sorts of things that would have taken me hours and days to find sometimes. However, when I showed the painting of the Carreño, the Pearls archives aren't digitalized yet, and there's a lot that is not digitalized. And on top of it, the artist's name is misspelled in the register of the archives. So it would take AI a little bit to find it. But yeah, I agree. It's helping us, and one day, who knows?
I'm going to take a question from the virtual, which is probably a long answer, and you referred to an article, David, but someone wants to know how they did uncover that the Galileo was a forgery. That this was a 3D printing. If all these other specialists, I actually didn't read that article that you were referring to, so this was news to me. So.
Well, the latest on the Galileo is actually quite interesting, because obviously they examined the composition of the paper, and all the labs in Berlin and Jena found the composition of the paper perfectly plausible. And then suddenly they found one strand of cotton in the paper. And of course, there was no cotton in 16th century paper. So, I mean, so it was an accumulation of little things. But I think, the thing that blew it all up was this. A very talented historian of science, who was actually a fellow at the Italian Academy, Nick Wilding, now teaches at Georgia State, is a historian of science. He was worried about this book from the very beginning. And so what he did was he went to look at all the copies he could find of the Siderius Nuncius. I mean, this was unique, this book, in the sense that it also had drawings. Why were drawings in the middle of what looked like a proof copy? There was nothing like this in the 60s, so it would have had to be by Galileo. So, it all seemed very interesting and plausible. At any rate, Nick went and looked at every single copy, and he found that there was one copy, a facsimile of the Siderius Nuncius, which had been published in Verona, which had a little squiggle on the bottom of the P going backwards in the copyright statement, cum superiorum permissu, at the bottom. And this tiny little squiggle was being reproduced. The one that was only in the facsimile was reproduced on the frontispiece of what turned out to be a fake. There was that little, tiny splodge, literally 1.5 millimeters, which he couldn't have gotten from any other, that didn't exist in any other copy of the Siderius
So
Nuncius.
that was in a way connoisseurship because he looked very closely and saw the squiggle.
But I'm not. But,
I mean, it
but wait
sounds
a minute,
funny.
Sharon. We're not talking. I'm not denying that that this is connoisseurship. I'm
Yeah.
not denying for 10 seconds that this is connoisseurship.
Yeah.
Certainly.
I would like to ask a question of the most of people here about what their views are about works which get demoted. And I'm thinking, for example, quite a number of years ago, my wife and I were in London and we went to a drawings gallery, and there was a beautiful small blue paper landscape, and the gallerist said, well, you know, this used to be attributed to Claude, but now somebody has done this study and found out that there's a whole group of blue ground works which can't all be by Claude, so they're now called works by the unknown somebody or other. But I, looking at it, I don't think, I mean, I actually felt, well, that's actually rather good because it's going to be less expensive. But did it change the quality of it, knowing that it wasn't by Claude and it was by somebody who we don't
That's a
know?
good question.
I mean, have you had situations like this, and do you feel disappointment? You know, it isn't a Caravaggio anymore, but and knowing it isn't a Caravaggio, does your cognitive system automatically downgrade it?
Well, I have a good example. Otto, you have to comment on this also. Because I remember when Ernst van der Wetering, the above mentioned, much admired by everyone, decided that the Polish rider in the Frick was probably not by Rembrandt. I refuse to believe it. The case was made for Dross. You've got to hang in there with your positive views until someone did, because in the end, Ernst van der Wetering changed his mind as well, and that's what we shouldn't forget.
Yes.
But isn't this good that every now and then people change their mind? This helps us ameliorate our judgment of works.
Actually, at that same talk, because we did the talk at the Frick, we were able to get the Frick auditorium for that talk. He decided to attach a 15-minute discussion of the Polish writer to what he was going to speak about. And he decided that, he said at that time, that there were two hands. That was the way he compromised that, and he did it based on quality. And he showed which portions of the painting he thought were really Rembrandt and which were a very good other painter. Do I have another question in the audience, because we're really coming close to the time? Ellen, yes, with Mike, please.
It's marvelous and very positive, your talk about connoisseurship, but in the advent of NFTs and the internet and asset purchases and the whole marketing of the art world now, so highly monetized, and I guess the extreme is the NFTs. How do you reconcile what you're doing, particularly Professor David, with your students who are focused on these issues now, I'm sure, as well? How do you reconcile what the importance of connoisseurship and validity and all of the issues you've already wonderfully discussed with what the reality of the marketplace when people are, even Christie's and Sotheby's just announced that they are going to take a big position in NFTs. What does that do to connoisseurship?
I don't think it does much to connoisseurship at all, actually. I mean, I think one of the things that we must, this is not really, I'm not sure it's a connoisseurship question, but the matter of NFTs is an economic question. I think in the terms of the history of art, we do want to ask ourselves, the history of art, what is regarded as art? But I think most of us should try to get away from the question of the definition of what is art now, because the art in the Renaissance was something quite different from whatever it is regarded as art now. I mean, I just say art is by acclaim in these days. That's the only definition we have left of art. In the Renaissance, you had to go to, belong to a guild, and you had to go through training, and you knew what art was. We have not a clue what art is. So, not a clue. So, let these crazy people make whatever financial investments they want to make. Good luck to them. But I don't think NFTs come into our business at all unless somehow the NFT reaches a level of quality, and that brings us back to the question which John asked.
And this is a virtual question. Would you comment on the newly demoted Vermeer?
I was going to talk about the Vermeer.
You were?
The newly demoted Vermeer should stay demoted.
Did you hear the answer? The newly demoted Vermeer should stay demoted. Well, I think on that very
And one more.
quote, I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank you all
Look at it.
for coming. Really.